So what is it about pfactor that all these videos seem to get wrong? Or at least they're very imprecise about explaining it. Well, stay tuned and I will tell you exactly what it is. And if you don't believe me, you can just go and look in the PHAK for yourself.
Oh, what a stroke of luck.
So most of these videos you see on YouTube, as well as maybe your flight instructor, say that the asymmetric thrust we experience when at a higher angle of attack is from that descending propeller blade having a larger angle of attack than the ascending propeller blade. That larger angle of attack gives us more thrust, which creates that left yaw. But if you actually read the PHAK, that's not the reason why we get asymmetric thrust. Let's get into it. The first thing I want to discuss in terms of asymmetric thrust is this notion of the angle of attack on the ascending blade and the descending blade. So a lot of these videos, they will show an aircraft, simulating straight and level flight. They'll have our lift right here. Since lift is perpendicular to our relative wind, that means our relative wind is here. Some of them will take a tape measure. They'll drop a tape measure from here, from our ascending blade, from our descending blade, and they'll tell you to look at that difference, measure that difference, and then what they will do is they'll have somebody tilt the aircraft back as if it were in a climb. They'll do the same thing. We have our relative wind, we have our lift, and then they'll drop that same tape measure, that measuring stick, and they'll say, see, look, the angle of attack of the ascending blade is greater than the descending blade, so that's going to give us more lift, which is going to create our asymmetric thrust and our yaw to the left. The problem with this is I think it's oversimplified and a little imprecise. One thing that these videos don't take into account is the rotation of the prop itself. So we have to remember, just like we're getting this vertical lift here from our relative wind that's coming straight at the plane, but we're also getting thrust from the propeller that's pushing us forward. And all this thrust is it's essentially lift, right? The propeller is just an airfoil, but it's just giving us basically horizontal lift. So it's lift, but it's just in a horizontal direction. So since we have lift also here, which is thrust, then we're going to have relative wind coming from either here or from here. And now when you consider all these perspectives of relative wind, it's a little bit harder to determine where the angle of attack of each blade actually is. Can it be determined? I'm sure it can, but I don't think I'm smart enough to determine it. And I think oversimplifying it into just one source of relative wind is a little imprecise, because you have to take into account all the areas of the relative wind in order to determine the actual angle of attack of each propeller blade. Now, are the propeller blades, is there a difference in the angle of attack? I can't be 100% certain. I don't know. What I do know is that the PHAK doesn't mention anything about angle of attack when discussing asymmetric thrust, at least in terms of the differences of the angle of attack in the ascending propeller blade and the descending propeller blade. It does discuss angle of attack in terms of when this force will be most pronounced, as well as when providing a clear and complex explanation of this, you would have to take into account both the AOA of the aircraft as well as the AOA of each blade and the wind vectors, which is something that we just touched on. It does not mention the words, the angle of attack on the descending blade is greater than the ascending blade. What it says is bite, right? And everybody knows this. from your private lesson, everybody knows it's just such a popular phrase, bigger bite. That the descending blade takes a bigger bite of air out of the ascending blade. But that doesn't necessarily mean angle of attack. And if they meant angle of attack, why don't they just say angle of attack? Here's what I think the PHAK means when they say bigger bite, and actually what they go on to explain if you read through the asymmetric thrust section. So let's imagine that our aircraft could fly like this. So we're flying like this, but we're not ascending. We're actually moving still in this direction. So we're still moving like that, right? So we're moving forward just like so. So let's imagine that we could fly like that, which would mean that our relative wind is still coming from this direction. And a few other things we'll label here. This we'll call our descending propeller blade in red, and in black we'll call our ascending propeller blade. Now we'll say that our relative wind is moving at 20 knots, and just for simplification's sake, we're just going to say that our propellers are both moving at 200 knots. Remember, I know that's not realistic, a little imprecise even, but this is just to simplify the means of understanding this. So again, relative wind 20 knots, both propeller blades are moving at 200 knots. And if you really want to break down the math on this, you can actually really break it down and really get into the weeds about it, but this is just a oversimplification. Now, one other thing that we have to remember and take into account, and that will help explain this, is our lift equation. So with our lift equation, remember we have lift equals our coefficient of lift, our density, velocity squared, and then our surface area. The important thing on this that we're going to focus on for this is our velocity squared. So the rest of that we can get out of there. And what do we need to know with our velocity squared? Well, our velocity, when our velocity increases, that means our lift also increases. And same thing, they're directly proportional. If velocity decreases, our lift is also going to decrease. So that's an important thing that we need to remember for the rest of this explanation, and that is in our lift equation. So velocity squared, let's remember that. Now back to our scenario here. Now let's talk about our ascending propeller blade. So this is our ascending propeller blade in black. This is rotating around the airplane just like so. And one thing some of you may notice here, or start taking into account, is that with this 20 knot relative wind, the ascending propeller blade relative to the wind around it isn't going to be moving at 200 knots, right? Because we have to take into account this relative wind that's moving. Since we have this relative wind that's moving this way, right? Let me get my green back out. Since we have our relative wind, we have to take into account that 20 knots. And what this is going to do to our ascending propeller blade is now relative to the air around it, relative to the air that is around this ascending propeller blade, that ascending propeller blade is actually only moving at 180 knots. Relative to the air that is around it, that ascending blade is only moving at 180 knots. Now if we look at the descending propeller blade, so this blade's coming around like so, and it's going to actually be getting a headwind from this relative wind. So remember, our relative wind's still moving this way. It's kind of hard to picture here in this, not being 3D, but our descending blade's coming around into our relative wind. In terms of in relation to the air that is around that descending blade, it is actually going to be moving at 220 knots, because this air that's moving this way, right, in this direction, is moving at 20 knots, And the propeller blade, we're still moving at 200 knots this way. So in relation to the air that is around this propeller blade as we're descending is actually going to be, it's going to be 220 knots greater than the relative air around it. 220 knots on our descending. This will be our ascending blade. Now you can probably see what's happening here. Remember, if we have a greater velocity, when velocity increases, then our lift is also going to increase. So our descending propeller blade is moving faster relatively in the air around it, in that relative air. It's moving faster than what the ascending propeller blade is. Since that's the case, what's that going to do for us? That's going to give us more lift, and that's going to create our asymmetric thrust. That's what the bigger bite is. That's what the PHAK means when they say that, bigger bite. And now, if I can erase all of this, we can imagine this from a more realistic scenario. If we move our airplane, we're on climb out, this is our angle of attack, and we still imagine our relative wind here. So now you can still imagine the same thing, the same scenario is happening than when we were like this. It's just here we were straight up and down, so the effects were more pronounced, right? So our relative wind was coming from here. So our relative wind was right here. And now as this, we're messing up here. But then as the plane moves down, those effects are going to be less and less pronounced. But still here, when the angle of attack is right there, you still have that relative wind is coming here. That's still going to be pushing. You're still going to have slightly more air that is going to be pushing this ascending blade up and going to be resisting the movement of this blade down, which is going to create difference in the relative velocity. It's going to decrease the velocity on the ascending blade, increase the velocity on descending blade, which is ultimately going to change the FAA calls the resultant velocity. So the resultant velocity of the descending blade is greater than the resultant velocity on the ascending blade, and that is what gives us our asymmetric thrust. Now, I hope all of that makes sense. I did try to make it as least complicated as possible. If there was anything that you didn't understand or anything maybe I misspoke about or you think I got wrong, please put it in the comments below. I always thrive on trying to increase my understanding and increase my knowledge. I'm still a pretty new pilot. I've only been doing this for 2 years, so I encourage you to, find your own information. This is just me reading from the PHAK and knowledge that I have gained from others, but I always look forward to increasing my knowledge and understanding where it is insufficient. So, good luck out there, guys. Fair seas and following winds, or whatever they say in the Navy.